Imagine standing on the docks of a coastal city in the mid-19th century. It could be Canton in China, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, or the port of Piraeus in Greece. The year matters less than the sight on the horizon. It begins as a plume of black smoke staining the blue sky. Then, a silhouette emerges, a squat black hull, devoid of the graceful white sails that have defined maritime travel for millennia. It moves against the wind. It moves against the tide, and as it draws closer, the sun glints off the polished bronze of rifled cannons swiveling in your direction. You are looking at a ship of the Royal Navy, and its arrival means your government has a problem. This was the reality of the Pax Britannica. For nearly a century, the British Empire maintained a global hegemony not just through the invasion of vast armies, but through a specific, terrifyingly effective doctrine known as gunboat diplomacy. It was a strategy summarized by a simple, unspoken ultimatum. Open your ports, adhere to our laws, and pay your debts, or we will level your city from the safety of the harbour. In the popular imagination, and often in the nationalist histories of the nations that suffered under it, gunboat diplomacy is portrayed as simple piracy. It is often viewed as the act of rogue, imperialist bullies, captains and admirals acting like Vikings with steam engines, blowing things up for the sake of plunder. While the destruction was real and the bullying undeniable, this view misses the terrifying sophistication of the system. Gunboat diplomacy was not random violence. It was a highly calculated instrument of statecraft. It was the scalpel of the British Foreign Office. It was a system designed to achieve maximum economic gain with minimum military expenditure. The goal was rarely to conquer territory. Britain already had more land than it could easily govern. The goal was to enforce free trade, to secure legal extraterritoriality for British citizens, and to ensure the financial machinery of the global economy kept turning in London's favour. To understand how a small island nation off the coast of Europe could effectively act as the world's police force, judge, jury, and debt collector, we have to look beyond the battles. We have to look at the machinery of coercion. We must answer the central question. How did the British Empire use the mere threat of naval force to coerce sovereign nations into economic and political submission without engaging in total war? The answer lies in a triad of power: a technological revolution that changed the physics of warfare, a global logistical network that created a panopticon of surveillance, and a ruthless willingness to target the economic arteries of any nation that dared to say, no, we are going to dismantle the mechanics of this system. We will step onto the iron decks of the SS Nemesis, the ship that broke the Chinese Empire. We will sit in the Foreign Office with Lord Palmerston as he justifies bringing a European nation to its knees over a single citizen's burned house. And we will witness the bombardment of Kagoshima, where the samurai of Japan learned the hard way that their swords could not cut through explosive shells. This is not a story of heroic charges or desperate defences. This is the story of how the world was opened at the barrel of a gun. This is the anatomy of gunboat diplomacy. To understand why gunboat diplomacy became such a terrifying force in the 19th century, we must first recognize the limitations of naval power that preceded it. For centuries, the Royal Navy, the navy of Nelson and Trafalgar, ruled the waves, but its power stopped at the shoreline. A wooden ship of the line was a magnificent beast, a floating fortress of oak and canvas, but it was a slave to the elements. It needed deep water, and more importantly, it needed the wind. If a foreign government wanted to resist British pressure, they simply had to retreat upriver. A massive 100-gun warship could blockade a harbour, but it could not navigate the shallow, twisting arteries of a nation's interior. It could not sail against the current of the Yangtze or the Pearl River to threaten a capital city. The wind was the great equalizer. If the wind died, the British Empire was becalmed. But in the 1830s, the Industrial Revolution collided with naval architecture, and the result was a quantum leap in military coercion, the steam-powered iron-hulled gunboat. The prototype for this new era, and perhaps the single most significant vessel in the history of colonial warfare, was the SS Nemesis. Launched in 1839, She was an oddity to the traditional naval eye. She wasn't built of noble oak, but of iron plates. She didn't rely solely on the capriciousness of the wind. She had a 120 horsepower steam engine. Most critically, she had a flat bottom and a retractable keel, allowing her to float in just 6 feet of water. The Nemesis was the technological key that unlocked the interiors of continents. When the First Opium War broke out between Britain and China, the Qing dynasty officials were confident. They believed, based on centuries of experience, that foreign barbarians were helpless in the intricate river networks of the Celestial Empire. They prepared defenses based on the logic of sailing ships. They were wrong. When the Nemesis arrived in the Pearl River Delta, the strategic calculus changed overnight. During the Second Battle of Chwempi in January 1841, the British unleashed this new weapon. The Chinese fleet, composed of war junks, was formidable by traditional standards. But the Nemesis did not fight like a ship. It fought like a predator that defied the laws of nature. Witnesses described the scene with a mixture of awe and horror. The Nemesis moved against the wind and against the tide, ignoring the elements that the Chinese sailors relied on for defense. She maneuvered with a precision that was impossible for sailing vessels, bringing her heavy cannons and rocket launchers to bear on the junks one by one. Her iron hull was impervious to the lighter Chinese weaponry, and her shallow draft allowed her to chase the fleeing junks into the shallows where they sought refuge. The result was not a battle. It was an execution. The Nemesis destroyed the Chinese fleet with almost casual ease, sending rockets screeching into the wooden junks, turning them into floating infernos. A Chinese observer, struggling to comprehend a ship that breathed black smoke and moved without sails, dubbed it the Devil Ship. This was the dawn of the Brown Water Navy. The Royal Navy was no longer restricted to the blue water of the open ocean. They could now penetrate the heart of a nation. They could bypass coastal forts and steam hundreds of miles inland to cut off trade routes, threaten administrative centers, and dictate terms directly to local governors who previously felt safe behind miles of river and marsh. The psychological impact of this technological asymmetry cannot be overstated. Gunboat diplomacy relied heavily on this shock and awe. It wasn't just about the destruction the ships could cause, it was about the hopelessness they inspired. How do you fight an enemy who can sail where you cannot, who moves without wind, and whose ships bounce off your cannonballs? The Nemesis proved that the barriers of geography were no longer a defense against British interests. The technological gap created a diplomatic lever. Capitulation was rational, resistance was suicidal. The mere appearance of a smokestack on the horizon was often enough to make a local ruler sign a treaty. The Devil Ship had arrived, and it had brought a new world order with it. However, a technological marvel like the Nemesis is useless if it is not where it needs to be. The world is a vast place. Oceans cover 70% of the planet, and the British Empire, for all its wealth, could not build an infinite number of ships. The challenge for the Admiralty in London was one of scale. How do you police the entire globe simultaneously? How do you ensure that a merchant in Zanzibar, a missionary in Fiji, or a diplomat in Peru feels just as protected as if they were walking down the streets of London? The answer lay in a masterstroke of logistical organization known as the station system. Britain effectively carved the world's oceans into administrative districts, or stations. There was the North America and West Indies Station, the East Indies Station, the China Station, the Mediterranean Station, and the Cape of Good Hope Station, among others. Each station was a self-contained naval fiefdom, commanded by an admiral who acted as a regional warlord. He had his own squadron of ships, his own supply bases, coaling stations, and crucially, the autonomy to act. This created a global panopticon. Just as the panopticon prison design creates the sensation that a prisoner is always being watched, the station system ensured that no coastal nation felt truly alone. A British warship was never months away. It was days, sometimes hours, away. This ubiquity meant that local rulers had to calculate the risk of British intervention in every single political decision they made. The horizon was never truly empty. But this physical infrastructure needed a political soul to animate it. It needed a doctrine that justified deploying a battleship to settle a bill. That doctrine came from the British Foreign Secretary and later Prime Minister Lord Palmerston. In 1850, a crisis emerged that perfectly encapsulated the arrogance and effectiveness of gunboat diplomacy. It involved a man named Don Pacifico, a Gibraltar-born Portuguese Jew who was a British subject living in Athens, Greece. During an anti-Semitic riot, Pacifico's house was burned down, and the Greek police did little to stop it. When the Greek government refused to pay him compensation, Pacifico appealed to London. To most nations, this would be a minor consular dispute. To Lord Palmerston, it was a challenge to the credibility of the empire. He didn't send a stern letter. He sent the Mediterranean fleet. British warships blockaded the port of Piraeus. They seized Greek merchant vessels and crippled the nation's trade. The Greek government, stunned by the disproportionate response, was forced to capitulate and pay Pacifico's claims. Palmerston was criticised in Parliament for using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. His defence, known as the Civis Romanus Sum speech, became the defining manifesto of the era. He drew a direct parallel to the Roman Empire, where the declaration Civis Romanus Sum, I am a Roman citizen, was a shield that protected a traveller anywhere in the ancient world. Palmerston declared, so also a British subject, in whatever land he may be, shall feel confident that the watchful eye and the strong arm of England will protect him against injustice and wrong. This was the terrifying promise of the station system. It meant that every British citizen, every trader, every tourist, every scoundrel, carried the entire weight of the Royal Navy on their back. If you touched them, you touched the Queen. If you refused to pay them, you were inviting a blockade. The station system ensured the ships were there to deliver the punishment, and the Palmerstonian doctrine ensured the political will to order it. The world was now a neighbourhood, and the British were the only ones with a police force. While the image of a smoking gunboat levelling a city is the most dramatic representation of this era, the true genius of gunboat diplomacy was that, ideally, the guns never actually had to fire. The British Empire was, at its heart, a commercial enterprise. It was a nation of shopkeepers, bankers, and industrialists. They understood a fundamental truth of geopolitics. Nations might rally around a flag to fight an invasion, but they will crumble quickly if you cut off their money. This brings us to the third and perhaps most effective pillar of the doctrine, economic strangulation. In the 19th century, the global economy was becoming increasingly interconnected. Nations were moving away from autarky and toward a reliance on international trade. For a country with a coastline, the harbour was its mouth. It was how it fed itself and how it paid its bills. The Royal Navy realised that they didn't need to burn a capital city to force a submission. They simply had to close the mouth. The blockade was the silent killer. It was a weapon of suffocation. A single British frigate, anchored across the narrow entrance of a harbour, could bring a nation's economy to a screeching halt. Custom revenues would vanish. Merchants would go bankrupt. Food prices would soar. The political pressure on a local ruler would build not from the fear of British shells, but from the screams of his own starving or impoverished citizens. The brutality of this accounting book warfare is best illustrated by the Christie affair in Brazil during the early 1860s. This incident is a textbook example of how the empire acted as an aggressive debt collector. The dispute began with trivialities. First, a British merchant ship, the Prince of Wales, was wrecked on the coast of Brazil, and there were allegations, never fully proven, that locals had looted the cargo. Second, 3 British naval officers, out of uniform and drunk, were arrested by Brazilian police in Rio de Janeiro for disorderly conduct. In a world of equals, these are matters for local courts, but Britain did not view Brazil as an equal. The British minister in Rio, William Dougal Christie, demanded a formal apology and significant financial compensation. When the Brazilian emperor, Pedro II, refused to bow to these humiliating demands, Christie didn't call for an invasion. He called the Navy. Admiral Warren, commanding the South America station, did not bombard Rio. Instead, He ordered his ships to intercept and seize 5 Brazilian merchant vessels entering the harbour. He held them hostage. It was essentially a state-sanctioned kidnapping of property. The message was clear. Pay us the money you owe for the Prince of Wales, or you will lose these ships and the trade they represent. Brazil prepared for war, coastal forts were manned, and the population was furious. But the economic reality set in. Brazil was dependent on trade, much of it carried on British hulls or financed by British banks. The seizure of the merchant ships was a tightening noose. Ultimately, under protest, Brazil paid the compensation. This was the gunboat aspect used as a scalpel. The British secured their money without landing a single soldier or suffering a single casualty. They leveraged their mastery of the seas to turn a sovereign nation's geography against it. It reveals the cold logic of the doctrine. War is expensive, munitions cost money, and soldiers require pensions. But a blockade is cheap. It requires only patience and presence. For the target nation, however, the cost of resistance grew exponentially. With every day, the harbour remained closed. The Royal Navy forced rulers to do a simple cost-benefit analysis. Is my national pride worth the collapse of my economy? 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. The cheque was written, the apology was signed, and the gunboat steamed away, its shadow lifting from the harbour, leaving the government intact, but the sovereignty shattered. But what happened when a nation refused to do the math? What happened when a culture valued honour more than economics? That is when the gun stopped being a threat and started being a solution. The genius of British naval doctrine lay in its careful calibration. It was an escalation ladder, a scripted performance designed to offer the opposing power multiple opportunities to back down before the first shot was fired. This performance was known euphemistically as showing the flag. It usually began with a single warship entering a foreign harbour, uninvited but not explicitly hostile. The ship would drop anchor within plain sight of the governor's palace. The captain would then send a pinnace ashore, not with a declaration of war, but with an invitation to dinner. This was the velvet glove. Local dignitaries would be brought aboard the British vessel. They would be treated to the finest wines and food the mess could provide. But every moment of their visit was a carefully choreographed display of disciplined violence. They would walk past rows of Royal Marines, standing as still as statues in their scarlet coats. They would see the crew conducting gun drills with a speed and mechanical precision that defied human error. They would touch the cold iron of the cannons. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. We are not barbarians. We are a machine. We are wealthy, disciplined, and technologically superior. Do you really want to fight this? Most of the time, the dinner was enough. The psychological weight of this display, the cleanliness, the order, the silent power, broke the will of the local ruler. He would sign the treaty, the ship would fire a polite salute, and leave. But if the ruler was stubborn, if he mistook British politeness for weakness, then the velvet glove was removed, and the iron fist was revealed. And by the mid-19th century, that fist had become infinitely more destructive due to a terrifying innovation: the Pajon gun. For centuries, naval warfare had been a game of bowling. Ships fired solid iron balls. These round shot would smash into wood, sending splinters flying, which killed men, but they rarely sank ships or destroyed fortifications outright. A wooden city or a stone fort could absorb thousands of solid cannonballs and remain standing. The Pajon's gun changed the physics of destruction. It was the first naval gun designed to fire explosive shells horizontally. These weren't solid balls. They were hollow iron spheres filled with gunpowder and tipped with a fuse. When they hit a target, they didn't just punch a hole, they exploded. Against the wooden architecture of East Asia, where cities were often built of timber, bamboo, and paper, the Pajon's gun was a weapon of mass destruction. A single shell could ignite a firestorm that no bucket brigade could extinguish. A single gunboat, anchoring just out of range of shore batteries, could now burn an entire city to the ground in an afternoon. This changed the mathematics of resistance. In the past, a local ruler might accept the risk of a few damaged buildings to preserve his honor. But with the introduction of explosive shells, the cost of resistance became total annihilation. The British captain could point his finger at a thriving port city and say, "I will erase this from the map by sunset." It was a coercive power that no emperor or shogun had ever faced. And in 1863, in the southern waters of Japan, the samurai of the Satsuma domain would force the British to prove it wasn't a bluff. They would push the escalation ladder to its final, fiery rung. The incident that would lead to the destruction of a Japanese city began, as these things often did, with a moment of cultural misunderstanding on a lonely road. In September 1862, a British merchant named Charles Richardson was riding near Yokohama. He encountered the armed procession of the daimyo of Satsuma, one of the most powerful feudal lords in Japan. By Japanese law and custom, a commoner was required to yield and bow. Richardson, secure in the arrogance of his British citizenship, refused to move aside. The samurai acted according to their code. Richardson was cut down and killed. To the Japanese, this was justice. A foreigner had disrespected a lord. To the British, it was murder. Under the Palmerstonian doctrine, the response had to be overwhelming. The British government demanded an indemnity of $100,000 and the execution of the samurai responsible. When the Satsuma domain ignored the demands, the Royal Navy was dispatched to the southern tip of Japan, to the Satsuma capital of Kagoshima. In August 1863, a squadron of 7 British warships, led by the flagship HMS Euryalus, steamed into Kagoshima Bay. The visual contrast could not have been more stark. On the shore stood the samurai, warriors steeped in a martial tradition that had remained largely unchanged for centuries, armed with swords and antiquated muskets. In the bay sat the pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution, armed with heavy Armstrong breech-loading guns and shell-firing cannon. Negotiations failed. The Satsuma officials, perhaps underestimating the willingness of the British to inflict mass casualties, stalled. Admiral Cooper, the British commander, decided to apply the standard pressure tactic. He ordered the seizure of 3 Satsuma steamships anchored in the bay, but the samurai of Satsuma were not easily cowed. As the British seized the ships, the Japanese shore batteries opened fire. This was the moment gunboat diplomacy shifted from a threat to an execution. The British returned fire, and the bay erupted. The engagement took place in the teeth of a brewing typhoon, with high winds and rough seas adding to the chaos. The British ships took hits. The captain of the flagship and several crewmen were killed by Japanese cannon fire, a reminder that the British were not invincible. However, the British response was cataclysmic. They didn't just target the shore batteries, they targeted the city. The Armstrong guns and shell-firing cannons began to lob explosive rounds into the wooden heart of Kagoshima. The high winds from the typhoon fanned the flames, turning the city into a firestorm. By the time the British fleet withdrew, huge swathes of Kagoshima had been reduced to ash. 500 houses were destroyed, along with the Satsuma steamships and factories. The bombardment of Kagoshima is a perfect case study because of its aftermath. Logistically, it was a messy battle, but politically, it was a decisive British victory. The Satsuma clan, witnessing the sheer destructive power of modern naval artillery, came to a startling realization. They could not expel the barbarians with spirit alone. In a twist of irony that defines the era, the Satsuma did not retreat into hatred. They pivoted to emulation. They realized that to defeat the West, they had to become the West. They paid the indemnity. And then, almost immediately, they approached the British, the very people who had just burned their city, to buy warships and cannon. The lesson of the gunboat had been delivered. The violence forced the opening of Japan not just to trade, but to modernization. It validated the British theory. Apply enough sharp, brutal shock, and the target nation will reorient its entire worldview to align with yours. But as the smoke cleared over Kagoshima, the British Empire was reaching the peak of its coercive power. The doctrine of gunboat diplomacy seemed unstoppable. Yet there were places on the map where the gunboats could not go. and there were rivals rising who would not be bullied. The Devil Ship had limits. If gunboat diplomacy was a magic wand for British foreign policy, it was a wand that only worked under very specific conditions. As successful as the Royal Navy was in coercing China, Brazil, and Japan, there were vast swathes of the globe where the sight of a Union Jack inspired not fear, but indifference. The doctrine had two fatal weaknesses: geography and parity. The first weakness was simple: a ship cannot sail up a mountain. At the exact same time, the nemesis was dismantling the Chinese Empire in the First Opium War, 1839–1842. The British Army was suffering one of its greatest humiliations in the First Anglo-Afghan War. While the Navy could project power hundreds of miles up the Yangtze, they could not project it into the Hindu Kush. Afghanistan was a landlocked fortress. There were no ports to blockade, no coastal cities to bombard, and no trade arteries that a frigate could sever. The British attempted to control Kabul using traditional land armies, and the result was a catastrophe. During the retreat from Kabul in 1842, an entire British army of 4,500 soldiers and 12,000 camp followers was slaughtered in the snows of the Khyber Pass. The contrast between the two wars, fought simultaneously, is the most important lesson in understanding the British Empire. It was a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire. Its power was absolute on the water and along the literal edges of continents. But as soon as British power had to leave the range of its naval guns, it became mortal. The gunboat in gunboat diplomacy was not just the delivery system. It was the entire source of the power. Without the boat, there was no diplomacy, only a vulnerable column of men marching into hostile territory. The second weakness was even more significant. Gunboat diplomacy was, by definition, a bully's tactic. It relied on asymmetry. It worked because the British had steam engines and Paishans guns, and the targets usually had wooden junks and outdated flintlocks. It was a system designed to extract wealth from the developing world, not to challenge equals. You could not use gunboat diplomacy against France or Prussia or, by the late 19th century, the United States. You could not sail a single frigate into New York Harbor or Cherbourg and demand reparations, because those nations could shoot back with equal lethality. As the 19th century progressed, the technology deficit began to close. The very nations Britain had bullied began to buy their own weapons, often from British arms dealers. The invention of the self-propelled torpedo and the naval mine in the 1870s and 1880s suddenly made the showing the flag tactic suicidal. A cheap, tiny torpedo boat costing a fraction of a British cruiser could now sink the pride of the Royal Navy. The waters were becoming dangerous. The era of the lone gunboat anchoring with impunity was drawing to a close. The psychological terror of the Devil Ship faded as the rest of the world learned how to build their own devils. However, before the sun set on this unique era of coercion, the legacy had already been cemented. The British had used this brief window of absolute technological dominance to rewire the global economy. They had forced the world open. And as we look back at the map of the 19th century, we see the results not in the territory Britain conquered, but in the markets they created. So, we return to our central question. How did a small island nation control the world's political and economic destiny without engaging in constant, ruinous total war? The answer is that the British Empire mastered the art of limited war. They realized that in the industrial age, you did not need to conquer a nation to control it. You did not need to occupy Beijing or Rio or Tokyo with thousands of soldiers, which is expensive and bloody. You simply needed to control the water that flowed past their doorstep. Gunboat diplomacy was the ultimate force multiplier. It was a system built on the triad we have explored: the technological terror of the steamship and the exploding shell, the administrative genius of the station system that placed a policeman on every corner of the globe, and the ruthless application of economic strangulation. It allowed Britain to build what historians call the informal empire. On a map, the British Empire is usually shown in red: Canada, India, Australia, but the real empire was much larger. It included China, Argentina, Siam, and the Ottoman Empire, nations that were technically sovereign, but whose economies and foreign policies were dictated by the British Foreign Office, backed by the silhouette of a cruiser in the harbour. The legacy of this doctrine is written in the geography of the modern world. The great global cities of the East, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, began their rise not as organic centres of local culture, but as treaty ports, forced open by British warships to facilitate the flow of opium, tea, and silver. The legal concept of free trade, which we take for granted today, was not adopted by the world voluntarily. It was often installed at the barrel of a gun. The era of the gunboat was the first era of true globalization. It forced disparate, isolated cultures into a single economic system. It was violent, it was arrogant, and it was often cruel. But it was also undeniably effective. It created a Pax Britannica, a British peace, where the oceans were safe for commerce, provided that commerce played by British rules. The gunboats eventually rusted or were scrapped. The nemesis is gone. The Royal Navy no longer rules the waves with undisputed power. But the lesson of that century remains. True power is not just about the size of your army, but the reach of your influence. The British showed that if you can control the flow of trade, and if you have the technology to project force where your enemy is weakest, you can turn the world into your marketplace. Britain opened the world with a skeleton key made of iron and steam, and once the door was kicked open, it could never be closed again. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.